So thank you all for joining us. And I'm wondering perhaps if you could, in 5 to 10 minutes, tell me about, I guess, current research projects that you're doing on this issue. And then we could open to a more broad discussion on the role of academia and universities in studying contexts of refugee and forced migration issues. Thank you. And maybe perhaps, Anastasia, you'd like to start, since we have a PowerPoint, on a research project that you collaborated with Professor Monterescu in Russia.
Sure.
I think Daniel will be showing the pictures a little bit later. So what I wanted to share with you was rather the background behind how we ended up writing this paper in the first place. So in my own case, I've been an activist at the Migrant Solidarity Group here in Hungary for the past 3 years. And next to that, I did my studies in sociology and social anthropology at the Central European University. I graduated in 2014. And although I was an activist and I was also researching these questions, these two things were never directly related for me, so I did not write my research about activism. My previous research was in the village of Serbia, where there is a refugee camp and there was very fierce local protests against the refugee camp. And that's where I did my previous research. And then from behalf of MIXO, which is the short name for the Migrant Solidarity Group, what happened was that although I wasn't engaged in academic research whatsoever last summer, but of course my involvement in my previous research in academia very much informed my work as an activist and vice versa. And what happened in the summer was that MIXO was engaged in many projects already, but when we saw what is going on in the country, we also decided to change our strategies. And there were many wonderful Hungarian humanitarian groups who started working, providing immediate aid to refugees in the transit zones, in the stations, and we were very happy to see this at MIXO. Our group, however, has not focused on direct humanitarian aid. Our work is mostly political. That doesn't mean involving party politics. We stay very much away from that. And in that capacity, we felt like it is the responsibility that MIXO is in the right place to start doing research in the train station on what's going on beyond distributing humanitarian help. So what we did in a team of about 8 to 10 people, we started going to the transit zones, to the different train stations in Budapest, and collecting interviews from people who were stuck at the station about what kind of human rights violations they basically met on while they were traveling through Hungary. And the way that this would work, we were always with native speakers of Arabic, Farsi, or Urdu, and then there were others as well. And we would approach people, of course, not immediately asking, how did you suffer on your way here? But rather simply sit down and talk with them, because this is something that people really felt in the summer, that they were really not looked at people or humans only as recipients of aid. So we would sit down, go through what did they experience, write notes about it. And MIXO is preparing a report on this that is coming out hopefully next month. It's all already written. And then I was doing, of course, when I was doing this research, then my training as a sociologist and social anthropologist from the department here at CU was very helpful in how to design such research. So this is the way in which I was involved in Keleti. And then from that started also somehow our research project, which resulted in a paper that came out in the American Ethnologist this January. Maybe I'll give it over to Daniel to talk a little bit about our paper and how that came about. Oh, yeah, sure.
If 2011 was the year of the revolutionary masses calling for emancipation in their homelands, 2015 was the year of the masses in movement for a better future elsewhere. While 2011 saw the emergence of theories of democratization, 2015 was marked by the return of the clash of civilizations paradigm and the rigidifying borders across the continent. If current trends continue, 2016 seems like the year of their expulsion from Europe. The project that we did together was an attempt to conceptualize and describe the dynamics of mobility and immobility of the migrants and refugees stuck in Budapest, but it is of course a case for a much broader investigation, that of the dynamics of border, the ability to transgress these borders, and the reactions of civil society. And we identified in very broad terms, because this was kind of an immediate reaction to the crisis, and it was very early on in the process, at least two vectors or two moments in civil society and state agencies. One that we described as a horizontal form of politics, and the other as vertical form of politics. Vertical forms of politics work through the concept of charity, while horizontal form of politics work through the concept of solidarity, and we managed to map different organizations working according to different logics. I'm an urban anthropologist, and what interests me particularly is the way that these contradictions and tensions manifest themselves in specific urban spaces. Here, in what is usually recognized in sociology as a non-place, a place of transition, which was situationally and for a few weeks and months re-signified as a radical moment, as a radical space of struggle. The challenge here is, of course, to try to follow these migrants and refugees and to investigate other spaces of radical opposition to the vertical logic of state and state agencies, but also to more broadly understand the configuration of borders today. Zygmunt Bauman, my favorite sociologist, recently noted, actually not so recently, it is in his book Modernity and Ambivalence, that modern states need chaos if only to go on creating order. And I believe that this dialectic of states creating their own specific challenges and feeding of these challenges, in our case presenting refugees as an existential threat to the sovereignty of European states, and thus enacting different policies of expulsion, exemplify some of the most profound questions we're dealing with today, right? Questions of sovereignty, questions of mobility, and the question of the permeability of borders.
Just add a few things, just further background, further forms, further ways in which we approached the issue. I think one of the things that we're trying to respond to was a nascent depoliticization of what, at face value, was a highly political and politicized environment. By depoliticization, I mean two things. One is the narrative of crisis, the language of crisis that was utilized both by people in support of refugees and those against. So the narrative of crisis, what it does is that perhaps what we think that it does is that it separates out a problem which is differentiated, as Daniel was saying, from the norm. A problem to be addressed so that the norm can reassert itself. And the other way that depoliticization works was through this immobilization. I think here in Europe we've got used to mobility marking our political. The act of mobility, the act of being able to move for work, the act of being able to move, the act of being able to redefine ourselves is the fundamental exercise of the political. And these processes of denying this helped create, I think, a narrative of depoliticization. I don't think that this necessarily worked. I don't think that a narrative of depoliticization was dominant or hegemonic, but it was there, and it led to two types of intervention, a humanitarian form of intervention and a governmental form of intervention, as Daniel has mentioned. What I think we were interested in was to rethink this refugee migrant movements over the summer in relation to processes of state making, not new processes, ongoing processes of state making. So we try, and it's quite a short paper that you really will see. So we try and touch on how the narratives and practices of exclusion and marginalization directed at migrants bear sometimes uncanny resemblance to similar forms of narratives and practices directed towards internal others, especially in Hungary towards their own. There were explicit mentions of, well, they're quite well known now, members of the Hungarian government saying that we have Roma, we have enough problems, we don't want to deal with migrants as well. And our point, I think, is that this narrative of crisis and the practices that the narratives enable create a problem to be intervened into, something which is distinct from specific histories of the making and maintenance of the nation state. And what we tried to show was how these movements of people were the counterpoint to the processes of stabilization and domestication, which is integral to the making of the nation state. Yes. So our fundamental aim, I think, and this is also the aim of what we would call activist ethnography, was to enter into the frame of field work while thinking through how narratives justify and normalize modes of exclusion and separation, and legitimize different types of state or state-like action. These are state-like action which centers, I think, either on the exercise of bureaucratic apparatus to control movements, or on humanitarian work, which reduces migrants, refugees, which can, always of course, which can reduce migrants and refugees to objects of aid.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I'm wondering, Professor Meleg, as an academic at a leading Hungarian university, perhaps you could share with us your thoughts on this issue and on the events that occurred in Budapest this summer.
Okay. Well, so I think that the original question was what academics can think about when they are seeing such changes, what we could see. And then what kind of a research I've been involved in. Then I would say that my long-term research has always been understanding demographic or population discourses in a global comparative framework. And then beside that, of course, as a sociologist, I have to, I can use whichever, my voice might be enough, right? Anyway. So that, and as a sociologist, I learned it from the classics that, of course, you are analyzing discourses and processes at the same time. And actually, the most exciting is the dynamic between the two. So, structural conditions and discourses and how they come together. In short, not to bore you completely, is that I very early realized that the recent developments in Eastern Europe are going very ugly, very aggressive. I started writing this in the 1990s. I'm very sad that I'm not proven wrong. And actually, the more it likes, I think I'm close to finishing because I'm not going to say anything more, right? It's really ugly. Now, why is it ugly? And that's a real question. Why is it ugly and why is it turning in this way? I think that's one of the things, longer-term concerns what academics should think about. And I think that we have to deal a lot with mental maps. Mental maps which create, and do not misunderstand me, even this discussion is about European refugee crisis. This is not a European refugee crisis, this is a global refugee crisis, and some of the problems also happen to appear in Europe, right? So such mental maps are very powerful actors. And to be honest, that we are losing ground in all different ways to have a more analytical, more balanced view of the whole situation, it's very much due to these mental maps what we have. That is to say that the crisis, the dramatic humanitarian suffering of people in a war-torn region is actually somehow doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in the media, it doesn't exist anywhere, and then everybody is talking what it is going to do with Europe. To some extent, of course, we can say, sorry guys, try to think about why you have made that region collapsing, first of all, and then after thinking about that, you might get to much better conclusions. But to be honest, on a discursive level, we are losing ground with such arguments. So I can see it. I've been working with the Hungarian media, at least with that part of the media which was interested in something. But I think that's one thing. Why is it happening? Now, this is something very important. In the sense also, the specialty of Eastern Europe in this. And I think that's another issue to talk about. Because, first of all, do not misunderstand me. Public discourses on refugees and in various demographic issues can be nasty everywhere in Europe. Do not misunderstand me. The violence which happened at the Hungarian border was minor as compared to the Calais event, right, which was going on forever. So, do not misunderstand me. I comparatively analyze such things. I can also listen to Mr. Cameron, how he's talking about migration issues, and I don't have very positive things to share with you, right? Nonetheless, there is some kind of specialty of Eastern Europe in terms of aggressivity and in terms of intolerance. And that is really something to think about, because at least Mr. Cameron he's talking exactly in the same way, but he doesn't say no migrants. And why Eastern European countries and public discourses are such that say zero. And then it's actually very exciting. Why is it happening? And I think we should do a lot of research about this, because I think that there are special things here which are very important. Let me just name 3 of them. To give you a live example for why I'm saying this is the following. It's for me an anecdote. So we arrived to Transylvania in August. And then we arrived at one provincial town, and we got out of the car, and then locals came up to us and they started asking the questions, have you got rid of the niggers? That was the question. And then I started thinking, come on, I mean, these people have not seen even a single refugee, right? And then the only thing they could get was the media discourse. And why are they so excited about the whole story? And I think in some ways it gave me a clue as well, and I started thinking a lot about this. One of the key problems here is that East Europeans are basically providing the migrant labor for the rest of the European Union. In case I can give you very large figures, out of Southeastern Europe, 80 million people do not live where they were born. And then they are actually providing this kind of migrant labor from England, from UK to Germany and all these places, which use this place. Plus, very importantly, East Europeans are very much worried about this competition. And competition in a hierarchical system can be very nasty. This is one of the key things. So what we can see here is some ways that they are worried about their own position within
this kind of a migratory space, and I think we have to work on this. Plus, very importantly, we have to put back the research into a more global perspective, and we have to see how, in case we are focusing on Europe, then we have to see how this, the relative position of this economy is changing, what structural changes are going on, how migrant labor comes into this picture, and how various public entities like the German government and so on react to various forces within this framework. And I think this is one of the most exciting things that we have to start working on. Otherwise, I could also see things happening in Budapest and in Hungary, but to be very honest, I always try to keep a little bit of a distance here, although I participated and was engaged in all the different things. But as a sociologist, I think I would like to have a broader picture. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering perhaps, in order to broaden this discussion, Professor Temper, you could tell us a bit about the Aleppo project and your work with that, and maybe tie it into what you think academia and universities can provide to, I guess, conflict and post-conflict zones.
Well, I'll just speak very briefly about the work that we've been doing in School of Public Policy on Aleppo. It's a project that is somewhat loosely structured and designed because the aim is to be as open and participatory as possible. And in some ways we are mixing a whole number of things, from sort of direct interview-based research through to polling, through to archival work in terms of collecting aspects of life in Aleppo, intangible culture, photographs, all sorts of issues like that. Plus, we're about to launch a participatory mapping project which will aim to look at what was in Aleppo before it's been substantially destroyed, and that unfortunately gets worse every day. We have no idea what will be left at the end of this war. One of the things, though, that we are trying to do is, in some ways, in our very, very small way, change the narrative about refugees. So a lot of the work is about provided by refugees, done by refugees, and about refugees and what they think about the situation. And we've been focusing mostly on refugees in Syria, because that's where most people from Aleppo have ended up, and that's where they mostly still are. There are still huge numbers of people in Turkey. I'm always, I find myself distressed by the use of the word crisis constantly in Europe, because I think it's a very sort of ahistorical term. It's less than 0.2% of the total European population this year, in the past 12 months. And if one compares it to, say, previous situations in Europe, 1944 to 1950, 14 million refugees arrived in Germany at a time when that country had been utterly destroyed, and probably more so than any society since Carthage. Simultaneously, there were another, from 1945 onwards, there were 12 million foreigners in Germany, foreign workers who'd been taken there, mostly former slave laborers, and people who'd been in concentration camps who needed to be repatriated or taken somewhere else anyway. So that was a crisis. This is not a crisis. This is something that European governments could easily deal with if they chose to do that. And what I find slightly frustrating is the kind of narrative that I think all too often we buy into of crisis and chaos. You know, I've just been in Berlin, and you know, the cars overturned in the streets, and the shop windows broken, and the Reichstag burning, and everything else. It's so ridiculous to be promoting this as the collapse of Europe. It's not the collapse of Europe. And nobody even says what that looks like. What does the collapse of Europe look like? I've worked for a long time on North Korea. One of the things I once did was to collect every single comment I could find predicting the collapse of North Korea. More than 400 in academic journals, going back to 1947, the year the country was founded. And yet, sadly, North Korea is still with us. And likewise, I suspect the European Union will still be with us in 40 plus years' time as well. But onto the, I don't want to go too much into the Aleppo project work because I've talked about that a lot, and there's lots of stuff on our website now and a growing amount of information there. But what is important is the kind of open participatory nature of that, and I do think that we need much more open participatory policy making that includes refugees. And gathering that information is a really critical aspect of university and academic life. And the sort of work we've just heard about, I think, is enormously important because it is reaching out and actually listening to refugees and their experiences in so many ways. We do need to do much more of that, less in the sort of mediatique manner of crisis and chaos and misery and everything else, but in a more patient, inclusive, participatory way that recognizes fundamental similarities and humanity of refugees. From a city that we should, well, from a country, and in the case of our focus on Aleppo, from a city that is profoundly important in European history. This was the city that preserved the body of classical knowledge that re-entered Europe during the Renaissance and provided much of the basis for our contemporary thinking on so many issues. Something we almost owe a historical debt to this place for what it's provided us with. But more broadly, I was just at this meeting in war-damaged Berlin, refugee-damaged Berlin, talking about exactly the issue of sort of what people should be doing about Syria refugees and what private foundations in particular should be working on. And sadly, there's actually very little money going into this whole field. But I think there are an enormous number of things that we should be doing, particularly in relation to Syria, although I do understand the refugee problem goes beyond that. We need to, I think at universities, shift the narrative in any way and push back on so many of these narratives. And I think one way to do that is to encourage Syrians to be able to speak for themselves. I would like to see the challenge to not just narratives about refugees, but also the narratives of the Assad regime, the very destructive narratives of ISIS and everything else, and to hear more Syrian voices in so many ways. And I think I would like to see, for example, university publishing houses get together and create a European sort of imprint of works in Arabic by Syrians on all sorts of issues. Everything from novels, to academic work, to everything else, to break through. And I know that's a long, slow process, but to change narratives, one has to have books being published, books being out there, people being encouraged, people being given positions to do this sort of work. I'd also like to see a much greater effort to provide university education for Syrians in the region surrounding Syria rather than necessarily in Europe. One thing we found in our work is that at least people from Aleppo want to go home. Now, the more educated they are, very loosely, the less they think they will ever go home. Now that makes obviously the idea of kind of education problematic. If we educate refugees, well, they'll never go home. And I'm afraid that has been the response of the international community for decades now. And in many ways, it's the source of the Taliban. We never educated Afghans, and so they were vulnerable to the Taliban. And not only that, in Afghanistan, they simply don't have sufficiently numbers of educated people to have enough teachers, have enough doctors, have enough university professors and things like that. We wasted a terrible opportunity by allowing them to rot in refugee camps without the remotest education. We can't make that same mistake. We've done the same with Somalis, done the same with all sorts of people. It's a terrible disfavor, and yet very senior officials will sit there and go, we're not going to educate people because it'll just encourage more of them to come. It's complete nonsense. People are fleeing for their lives. They're not going somewhere to have a mediocre, effort at education or to live in a dismal refugee camp. So I really would like to see much more effort there, and I think there are a number of things that can be done. And the first step is to work with existing institutions in that part of the world and really expand what they can offer their own people and what they can offer Syrian refugees. Then I think there are ways in which to overcome certain things like language issues and whatever, using some of the new technology that's available. So have a university course, but also deliver it online in Turkish, Arabic, and English. so that you can attend a university, but if you're struggling a little bit, dealing with Turkish or whatever, you could also see that class translated into Syrian or dubbed or subtitled or whatever. So I think there are ways of addressing some of the obvious problems. And it's also, I think, a possibility of how to really boost the overall quality of education in Turkey, Jordan and Lebanon in particular. Now I think the initial sort of surge should be towards jobs that would be very useful immediately, that would immediately lead to employment opportunities for graduates, and that's issues such as teachers, nurses, construction managers, project managers, all sorts of things like that, but mostly in the realm of relatively practical education. I also believe that education must always go beyond that where possible. But I do think we should be doing much, much more, and it would be good to see governments actually respond to the demand for tertiary education, which is quite substantial across that region, and there is a shortage of it. We need to do that, but we need to do it in a way that's also sensitive to the needs of Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon in particular. When one looks at the scale of these things, they are all kind of feasible within the budgets that we spend on various other aspects of European life. These are easily affordable without significant shifts in budgets, taxes, or anything else. But they tend not to be implemented because I'm afraid that the sort of global machinery of aid is quite indifferent to anything beyond primary education. I mean, they always say in the development world that UNICEF stops caring about you when you're 5 years old. And that's kind of true. And this is, the organization that dominates issues around young people. There is no organization in the world that cares about 18-year-olds. And yet, 16 to 25-year-olds cause more or less all of the violence in the world. And yet we have no focus on them whatsoever. And we have next to no interest in them in terms of delivering services to them, education, job opportunities, and whatever. And yet they are, I'm afraid, the biggest providers of violence in the world. That is the age where people are most vulnerable to all sorts of problems. And so we should be doing much, much more for people in that age group, principally to ensure that they have some sense of the future. These are, vulnerable ages because you are looking towards adulthood, you are looking towards the future. If you end up sort of despairing at everything in that age group, then I think you're very vulnerable for the rest of your life. And we need to do much, much more to help that particular group. I do, applaud my colleagues, particularly Prem, for his initiative here to help in the education of refugees. I think in many ways we can all do things as individuals, and many of you are. I think I have to say I'm very proud that CEU and its students in particular have responded, I think, with a real generosity of spirit and a real sense of that, individual action does matter. It's quite important to get up and do what you can. At Yale, for example, when everything here was erupting, people were going out to help in every way they could. People were protesting about an email that had gone out about Halloween costumes. So I did feel a certain sense of smugness that at least I didn't work at a university when the students were doing that. But I do feel that universities do, in certain ways, offer a place of idealism, and that we should never kind of lose that. But we have to extend that out into the world in a great many ways. And I do believe that education has an enormous power. And one thing we know from talking to many Syrians is that there's a desperate demand for education and a desperate desire for it. And that's why people in some ways are just terrified of losing the possibility of education in so many ways. And when you talk to people who are coming through here or elsewhere in Europe, that was one of the things that they're really seeking, is a chance not to miss out on education, to better themselves, to do that. And we need to provide that here in Europe, and we need to provide it in the kind of frontline countries, if you like, around Syria.
Thank you for your comments. I'm really grateful that you raised the issue of education, specifically amongst young people who are vulnerable and young people who are in transit. And I'm wondering, perhaps Professor Rajan could tell us more about CU's efforts in
Yes, I think first one is to give some context.
Yeah, I think I'll first give a little bit of context for that, and then Prem can zoom into what's going on at CU in particular. So, picking up on what Bob was saying, the first question that people ask when you meet them, when they come to Hungary, is A, where can I go so that I can bring my family? And B, where can I go to school? Because I want to be a doctor, dentist, or whatnot. And it's quite heartbreaking, of course, because as an activist and as somebody who's researched this, I know the context very well. And I know very well that because of European Union legislation, the Dublin regulation, they will need to stay in Hungary, they will need to be registered here. And we often, when we talk about Dublin, we often just think about this first point of entry to Europe, whereas actually Dublin is something that regulates people's lives for years to come. Now let's say that people actually do stay in Hungary, they register, they get a nice refugee status, then what happens? What are the chances for education then? So you might or might not know that in the current system, refugees are not entitled to Hungarian language education whatsoever. They get a certain amount of money per month, which is not that much, and they're expected to pay a private language course from that, which obviously doesn't happen. And this is something, for instance, that our group does in collaboration with other volunteers. We run a free Hungarian school. Now, there are a few education places that are offered to people who have a refugee status, but we're literally talking of 2 or 3 places per year in things like welding, etc., which is something that people are very grateful for. But of course, in order to go to school in Hungary, you have to be fluent in Hungarian. So there you go. And what do? You speak fluent English, you have a refugee status, you're from Afghanistan. Well, of course, you do what any Hungarian would do, and you start looking into education opportunities, bachelor's, master's degrees in other countries in Europe, just like we would. And this is where the question comes. Free movement within Europe, we take it for granted, but for those who have a refugee status, they do not enjoy the same rights. So you can apply to a master's degree in Germany, in the Netherlands, in the UK, but you will not be considered as somebody who would be applying from Hungary, therefore eligible for European Union tuition fees, therefore eligible to be for a visa. If an Afghan refugee gets a place to study, say in the Netherlands, they will A, have to pay ridiculous amounts of tuition fees, just like any third country national should, and B, they will have to apply for a visa, just like they would from Afghanistan, which means that you have to prove that you have enough money to support yourself for the duration of your studies. And this is where the question of this region comes into play as well, because in Western Europe there are plenty of education opportunities for refugees. Say, especially if you look at the UK, many universities have started special scholarships for those with a refugee status, but these are for people who have a refugee status from that country. And when we think of the buffer zone countries of European Union, say Greece, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, if you have a refugee status from these countries, you don't have access to those scholarships. So, and this is something that directly leads to people leaving these countries and going and working in the black markets in the grey economy in Western Europe, because that is literally the only opportunity you have. And as to the role of universities and their responsibilities, with regards to these questions, I think we need to separate our responsibilities as people who work for universities, as academics, and then secondly as institutions. And I think Prem can talk more about what, for instance, CU can do and has done as an institution. And I would just like to point out something that we can do as people who are engaged in academia. As anybody who has ever taken part in an intercultural communication training of some sort knows that if you want to battle things like xenophobia, you don't start talking to the other. You don't get to know what are the Muslims like, what are the Afghans, what are they like, but you get to know yourself. And as, for instance, CU and other universities in Hungary, we're full of people who have done excellent research on Hungary and how our society here works. then I believe that our responsibility is to share that knowledge in a language that is accessible to the rest of the society. And I know, for instance, in Hungary there are some NGOs where you have people who are academics but also work in NGOs who are engaged in this kind of work. And in my opinion, the responsibility of the university should be to further encourage these kind of activities from academics. And about institutions, I think I'll pass it on to Prem, who can talk of a very successful new initiative.
At the start of this term, about 4 weeks ago, we at CEU, members of staff, faculty, and students at CEU, together with members of the group MIXO, started something we call the Open Learning Initiative, or OLIV. Look for us on Facebook and like our page, CEU. What we do is that we offer 4 types of courses. We offer courses in English at 3 different levels. We offer practical courses. There's a course on careers and an Introduction to Hungary course giving information about welfare systems, education systems, and so on in Hungary. And then we have an academic component, which centers on academic tutoring. So we try and work in small groups with students to try and get them to make applications to universities, BA or MA programs. And we also have an academic course every year. Now, why we're doing this, that's something else. I think we're all aware that as we do this, it's a very small drop in a very wide ocean. I'm sure that many individuals will gain something from this, something tangible and at times something intangible as well. The experience of being in an academic climate, the experience of actively breaking down barriers. But there's also something else here, and I think the so-called refugee crisis, one thing that it has invited universities to do, and I think CEU has been at the forefront of this, is to redefine what it is to be a university in times of ostensible crisis, in times of emergency. What it is to think about the society that we serve, and what it is to think about education, and how we may question the barriers which arise in society, which define how educational programs are provided. So while OLIV, CEU's our Open Learning Initiative, I don't want to put a name to it and say this is what it is doing, this is what it has done. It's an opening. It's an opening for engagement with refugees and asylum seekers in Hungary. It's a common engagement between teachers and students to try and see where we go from this. We have the practical aspects, we teach English, we do academic tutoring, but there's something more there, which is in process, it's something that we're defining. And as we do that, I think we also call into question the role of the university, what the university might do. I think one terribly depressing element of the crisis over the summer was the silence of public institutions in Hungary. And to my mind, universities have to be in the forefront of this, in the sense of, I think, I'm an academic, so I'm a little bit biased, but I think universities are those institutions which guarantee a public life in one form or another, guarantee a vibrant, questioning, and critical public life. And I think that through these courses, in a small way, but I think in a growing way, I think what we are trying to do is to reinvigorate this idea of the public and what it is to exist publicly, both as individuals and as an institution. I think it's important then that engagement as an institution requires thinking the university in relation to public life, society, and how, and really, I think for those of us who are academics or students in to try to think through this long historical role that universities have had, which is about guaranteeing a vibrant public life, and to see how, unfortunately, this has been sometimes ameliorated, where we become service providers, and we're not. We never have been. CEU, the nature of CEU, is that it can never be a service provider, and I think now it's very important towards refugees and migrants, also I think towards other marginalized populations, to try to understand what it is to be critically engaged. And I don't think we at all have any answers of what this is, but we have openness, and I think that's welcome. And I want to add one more thing that we're trying to do. Again, some of us at CEU, some of us at Mixo, which is trying to come up with a more systematic one-year preparatory program. One of the things which Stina mentioned is the difficulties that refugees have in moving, to go and educate themselves. They have also, if they do manage to move, or if they are in a country where university access is reasonably possible, one very depressing thing happens very often is that they're not admitted to universities because they don't have a physical copy of their diplomas, or their previous degrees are, under-recognized. So BA degree is recognized as high school diploma. So we're trying to come up with a one-year preparatory program. We're seeking funding, if you can help, to train students, to prepare them to make a BA or MA application in university, systematically.
Thank you for sharing your perspectives. Let's open the floor to comments and questions from the audience and kind of broaden this discussion a bit. Would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I would like to, I think, very important points have been raised, and let me just react in 3 sentences, right? The first one, I very much like what you said. It's very important. 1 million children are without any type of an education. And I'm pretty sure that you're absolutely right, that something is to be done. But the key problem is the following, that we keep on talking about Europe in this respect, but the key problem is not here. The key problem is in Turkey, Jordan, and all these countries. And then up till now, out of even European Union money, not a single camp was built, not to speak about school. Right? So in that sense, I mean, there is this talk about 3 billion euros, out of which not even a penny went there, and even in case you calculate it with numbers, the 3 billion euros is something which is just definitely not enough for even just for the basic things. So when we start talking about these things, then we have to speak about something very big and something very important and what is to be done immediately. Even here I offer my free services to go even to Turkey, to educate, to teach, and then to do whatever. Not here. In this country it's more or less impossible. This country is in the Guinness record. 340,000 people went through the country. Out of that, 1,200 are in the country, out of which 800 are in prison. Right? This is what we are talking about, right? I mean, we are in the Guinness record, I can tell you, because out of that amount of people, so little remains. That's it. So I think in this respect, I think it's very important to see the focus where we are going. The other educational things which are very important, and then let me just draw the attention to 2 things. One, although I was not doing an enormous amount of activism, but basically half of my year was spent to feed the press with reliable data. So honestly, every week I work 2 or 3 days for the press to give them according to, they are very special people, press people are very special people, you have to work a lot with them. But it was very important that sometimes it had an effect. So one of the biggest circulation articles in Hungary on actually refugee data and things, this was done by us in the background in order to, and this I think is something terribly important. Anybody who can do anything in this respect is extremely useful, because the public discourse is full of lies. Okay, so in case you read, this is the German Immigration Authority statistics for last year. None of the figures you can hear in the TV or on the internet are right. Okay, much smaller number of refugees actually got into Germany, right? So these are very important things, and then we have to do this struggle. The very last thing, I don't want to defend Hungarians, I'm the last, I've been super critical. Nonetheless, here university people and academics have been doing a lot. Two of us sat down at the end of April when we realized that Mr. Orban had this fantastic idea of placards. You know these famous placards? And we wrote 2 sentences. I mean, 99% of the academics working on migration, all institutions involved, we wrote the following 2 sentences. This is absolutely unacceptable, and you finish it now. That was the letter. I sent it to the Prime Minister. Of course, there was no reply. I figured it out. But just to say, Hungary is, in this sense, is a very special country. You see a lot of repression, but at the same time, you see a lot of other things, and I think this is something to be stressed.
If I may, to address the question of what's next and the role of academia, I would like to point. I would like to point to 3 related processes. One is the shattered cosmopolitan idea of what used to be called the post-national Europe. The second is what we can call the revenge of the territorial state. And the third is the disturbing Hungarianization of Europe. That is the de facto turning of Europe as a model of, and sometimes a model for, Europe. Now, the challenges, so what about us? The challenges for politically engaged academics, or what Yehuda Elkanah once called concerned intellectuals, is mainly a search for a new conceptual vocabulary in the face of the collapse of previous paradigms about borders, mobility, and human rights. One of the reasons I think that the academia is silent is that it has no words. It is at loss to theorize the present. And I think one of our major responsibilities is to try to find the right words. This is partly this can be done partly by pointing precisely to the points of failure, to the points of what we can call the unintended consequences of immobilizing efforts. Last summer we saw how alterities, how different historical and cultural others, like the Jews and the Roma in Hungary, are coming together, either voluntarily or because they are just grouped together by local discourses. There is an element, there is an underlying cosmopolitan potential in this crisis. There's also a potentially new way for us to highlight the different solidarities that were left invisible before, that were rendered invisible. And for this we need new methodologies. We were just kind of, in this article and in Prem and Stina's work in general, there's a lot of effort to try to sketch new methodologies, what we can call the cross-border ethnography, which is a way to document cross-border activism. We need to document the subjectivities of migrants and refugees, to represent them, to voice them, to treat them with respect and theorize their agency. We need to document what is often called the liminal drift of refugees. We are now applying for funding that would allow us to follow refugees and migrants wherever they go, and to tell their story. And their story, in my mind, is about the ultimate challenge to European purity, to the nightmare of politically bounded spaces. And for this we need to imagine and also allow theoretically the creation of mixed space, and with it mixed cities and mixed citizenry and mixed nation states.